Today we're going to talk about promoting content and measuring. I left some extra time at the end for Q&A. I may stretch things out a little bit because the promotional part has a lot of little details, as does analytics. And if I have time to go deeper into them, I really would like to, because they're obviously pretty key to all of this. Just a very quick refresher on what we've already talked about. We've already discussed the why, the what, the how. We talked about the rules last time. We talked about researching your audience and developing a calendar. We're kind of here on the timeline. We're getting much more specific in this one. There'll be a lot of very specific best practices. Analytics gets very, very specific. There is still that link bundle out there, and I'm adding more and more stuff to it as we go. And what we've talked about so far is just this idea of the importance of content in the overall marketing stack, how the real funnel, which isn't really a funnel at all, works, and the fact that most companies focus on content at this end of that funnel, but they need all of it, and they particularly need stuff on the discovery side. The goal of creating this content is to provide a return on time invested, so that when people come to your site, they feel like there's something worth seeing and that they didn't waste their time. Please remember to mute your phone or your computer if you're logged in, because I am recording this. There's 3 basic types of content. The 70-20-10 structure is what I've talked about. And you plan your calendar and your general content planner around those 3 types because of the effort that they take and the way that you break up resources. I talked about 8 basic rules. And now this time I'm going to talk about how you do measurement and how you promote content. So promoting content is a little bit of a side trip here. It's something that in content training is very important. A lot of folks either ignore it or just stick to organic promotion. I'm mostly going to talk about some organic. I'm going to go into paid. I know that there's issues around budget and things like that. There always are. I just want you to be aware of the options there and of how it can pay off so that you can have that discussion within your organization. So in organic promotion, there's some obvious sources, right? There's LinkedIn, Twitter, there's Google+, there's Facebook. Google+, I emphasize LinkedIn and Twitter here because LinkedIn is kind of a no-brainer for you, right? You're a B2B. This gives you an opportunity to go directly to the people who you most want to reach. So there's a lot to be said for that. LinkedIn also crosses over with SlideShare now, and I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Twitter is a strange beast. It's where a lot of geeks hang out, but it's also where a lot of the journalists and the media influencers, which is a phrase I hate, but I have to use it, the influencers tend to hang out. So if you want to make sure that they're going to see your stuff, that's a really good place to start. Facebook can be a very surprising resource. David told me that you use it for internal purposes, but also you might be surprised at the kind of coverage you can get there, particularly in paid promotion. And then Google+, in spite of the fact that it seems like nobody uses it, crosses over into so many other spaces. It's used a little bit to inform. It's used a little bit to inform search results. It's used a little bit to inform stuff in YouTube, things like that. So Google+ is pretty important as well. And sort of the secondary or supplemental networks, YouTube is very obvious, I think, because you can do videos and things around what you do. You can do walkthroughs of product, but you can also take some of your educational content, the non-promotional stuff, and repurposing is very important, and it's something I've not had a chance to talk about much. But if you do something like a slide presentation, you can write a blog post about it. You can put the slides on SlideShare, and you can do a screen captured video, sort of like this one, where you do your training. You can put all that out there, right, and have 3 different locations. StumbleUpon is possibly the most underrated of all of the social networks out there, and it's what I like to call a social voting network. It's similar to Hacker News, it's similar to Reddit, similar to sites like that. And when I talk about StumbleUpon, you can kind of assume I'm talking about all of those. So StumbleUpon, all the social voting sites, they're a little bit of a shot in the dark. You post your content there in the hopes that that one key person will see it and cause it to really take off. You want to be a little careful about those networks, because if you're not careful about those networks, you can run directly into what I call the cynic brigade, which is the folks who hang around on those networks and seem to just spend their time blasting people who post stuff that they don't think is relevant. So you want to be a little bit careful. StumbleUpon has the least problem with that because of the nature of that network. People have this bar in their browser. When they click Stumble, they go to a piece of content that they might seem, in which they might seem interested, and then they can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. But there's nothing there that can expose you to a lot of negative comments. Whereas on Reddit, Hacker News, those kinds of sites, people can really get going, and the comments tend to feed on each other. So be very cautious about what you post to those networks. You definitely don't want to do anything remotely promotional on Hacker News or Reddit. Don't even do a paid promotion on Reddit. It's just not a good idea. Instagram seems like a totally consumer network, but you can put images on there of products, and you can put images on there that if the image in and of itself is instructional, or if it's data focused. So if you have something that's about the state of the industry, or something about comparing the pluses and minuses of different methods, again, non-promotional, that's a good place to put it. Vine, which allows you to do short videos, like 6 to 7 seconds, can be actually amazingly good for quick little tutorials, quick little, here's how you do this. So don't ignore those networks. Don't work to put stuff in them. Don't say, okay, we need to do a post to Instagram, because clearly you're not going to have that much stuff. But do think about, okay, every now and then I may have this one piece of content that really lends itself well to those networks. Now, best practices around all of those networks are very similar. So you want to test everything. The two biggest factors are going to be around posting times and the content of your tweets, your posts, or whatever. And text is not the best way of describing it. Whatever media you're putting into your post is a better way of putting it. I use a tool called Buffer to test my post times. And what Buffer lets me do is queue up posts. So I can queue up things to post out at specific times. And then I can see which ones work the best. And I like to curate content, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Curation of content is very, very useful if you want to test what goes out when and how well it works. So, for example, here, when I talk about curation, I'm talking about finding other people's content that I think might be useful to my audience and posting it to LinkedIn, to Twitter, wherever else. When I do that, I can watch and see what gets the best coverage. You can see this was a bad day for me. I didn't get a whole lot of coverage of anything. But what I can do, and what Buffer will let me do, is I can then look at the analytics portion and see what the best times of day were, what kind of posts got the most attention, and then I can use that data to really figure out, okay, what worked the best. If you see here, I did get 52 clicks on one particular tweet, and I already know this, but in this case, it's because there's strong emotion expressed in the topic of the tweet, right? Mom called, she hates your homepage carousel. The word hate is what got all the clicks here, because I work in the marketing world and marketers love to hate things. It's an unfortunate truth. Social Bro is another great tool for tracking what's working and what's not working, on Twitter especially. There's also tools like Hootsuite and TweetDeck. I love Hootsuite because it works across many different networks, and I'll talk about that in a minute as well. Again, talking about curation, it's really important that you curate content if you have any time, because curation of content will help you build that audience. All right, if people start to see that you're a good source of information just because you find cool stuff and get it out to them, particularly in your industry, because your audience is not just sitting around finding links to things. If you can get those folks paying attention to you because you send them interesting stuff, that builds your audience so that later on when you post something, again, non-promotional most of the time, that's going to put you in a very, very good position because you'll already had captured the interest of that audience. I've built my audience on Twitter, on Google+, on LinkedIn around curation. And if you want to think about proportions, I would say 1 out of every 20 posts that I do points back at something I or my team has created as opposed to other people. And then 1 out of 10 of those posts are promotional. So again, 1 out of 10 or 1 out of 20 posts that I do on a network are something that I or my team created. And then of those 1 out of 20, maybe 1 out of 10 of those is something that's purely promotional. So you can see the promotions are very rare, but they're there. And you can really time your content around them. And ideally, those promotions should be promoting a piece of premium content, right? A white paper, a video, an opportunity to go to a baseball game. I saw some of those signups there. Those are the kinds of things you want to offer. Other best practices, make sure you use SlideShare. I know you use it to some extent. It's a fantastic audience builder because when you post something to SlideShare that people like, they're going to start passing it around using Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. In addition, if you build a big audience on SlideShare, you start to get featured on the SlideShare homepage. And I can tell you that can be an enormous driver of brand and presence. And you can, of course, embed those slide presentations on your own site. So if you're going to present the slides to your audience anyway, using your blog, using whatever other resources, use SlideShare as the tool to do it. There's really nothing to lose there. I know that may mean people spend time on another website, but chances are the people who see it on SlideShare weren't going to see it from your site. They were wandering around SlideShare looking for that stuff. If you want to build an audience on SlideShare, again, curation of content can be really helpful. So you can go on SlideShare, you can follow interesting people, you can see what kind of things they're posting, you can like their posts, comment on them, they'll start following you back, and you build an audience. Just so you know, for curation, I usually set aside 15 to 20 minutes twice a day to do my curation, once in the morning, once around lunchtime. And what I'll do is I'll take a few minutes on LinkedIn, just looking for stuff that other people in my network have posted, looking at the homepage, looking at things I find interesting, and I'll pick 2 or 3 things if I can find them that I really think my audience would like. And then I like them on LinkedIn, and I'll go and post them on Twitter. I'll like them on SlideShare, and then I'll post them on Twitter, on LinkedIn, wherever else makes sense. Then I'll go look at other networks. So I'll take a look at my LinkedIn following and follow the people that I follow. I'll look on Twitter. I'll look in any other sites that I find really interesting, which may include things like Hacker News, just from personal interest. And I'll post those out to my audience. A great tool to do this curation so that you don't have to go and do it by hand, going from site to site, would be a tool called Feedly, if you don't use it. And just a quick show of virtual hands, if folks can do that, just let me know. Does anyone out here use some kind of feed reader like Feedly to keep track of things? Okay. So if you're not using it, check it out. I'll put the link in the link bundle. But it's well worth taking a look because you can take almost any feed from anything, including SlideShare, including Twitter, including your favorite websites, and integrate it directly into Feedly so you can look at one list of things. Now, SlideShare also integrates with LinkedIn. So if you go on LinkedIn, you can have slide presentations show up directly on your profile page, on your company profile page, whatever else. That is well worth doing. I have driven a lot of audience back and forth between the two presences, and while again that's not content that's on your site, it builds the audience that helps you promote the content that's on your site. So it's very, very helpful. I've seen a very direct correlation between growth in SlideShare presence and growth in the spread of my content. Other best practices, make sure you answer comments and questions across all those networks. So if someone posts a question on your blog, obviously reply to it. If they even just say, "This is awesome, thank you very much," and they're not spamming you, because there's a lot of spam comments like that, but if they say, "This was great, I learned, this one point you brought up about X and Y was really interesting, I may have a different opinion, but this is really helpful," and they point to specific things, reply to that. Say something, even if it's just thank you. but also answer questions and comments across other networks. And this is where I use a tool like Hootsuite. Hootsuite lets me use Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all together in one place. And the one thing that they don't let you use very easily yet is Google+, unfortunately. Google+ is still a place I have to go separately. There's rumors that they're working on an API to connect to things like Hootsuite, but I wouldn't guarantee that simply because I'm not sure that Google is building out Google+ as a social network. I think that they're building it out as a platform that can integrate with all their other tools like Gmail and YouTube and everything else. And then they consider things like YouTube to be their social networks. So I'm digressing a little bit, but you get the idea. Google Plus is a separate thing, and you probably have to treat it that way. Other great tools to do this are TweetDeck, even though it's more focused on Twitter than other tools. Sprout Social lets you track lots of stuff at once, but Hootsuite is definitely my Swiss Army knife. It even lets me do scheduling. So the other best practice here is obviously follow all the rules we talked about for content. So if you do a tweet, it should follow the blank sheet of paper rule. It should definitely pass that test. Make sure it's active voice. Make sure you're talking to your audience, using active voice, saying you, all that kind of stuff. Also, use scheduling. Repost. If you post something and it doesn't get any response at all, think about the time at which you posted it and the time zones in which people might be reading it. I will frequently, if I post something in the afternoon, I'll do a repost in the morning that says something like, just reposting this for all you East Coast sleepyheads. And then I repost it, and you'd be amazed what you get out of it. If you go 2 to 3 days and there's no response, just post it again. You can say that you're reposting it. There's nothing wrong with that. People don't mind as long as you don't repost it every half an hour. You can also schedule those reposts and just say, okay, you know what? I'm going to make sure I repost this 3 hours from now. Or you can schedule a succession of posts. If you have a sequence of content, maybe you're doing the 4th installment in a 4-part series. So you do first you post about the 4th one, and then you go back and you schedule posts of 1, 2, 3, and 4 so that people are reminded over time. A lot of this is dealing with the stream effect where things just go flying by. I apologize, I seem to be losing my voice, which is a bad thing in these circumstances, but you want to make sure that you do show up in people's feeds when you can. And that brings me to something else, which is paid promotion. Now, paid promotion is not expensive. I want to make sure you understand this. There are some forms of paid promotion that cost $50. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because most content is not super content. It's not just going to naturally generate an enormous audience. No matter who you are, no matter what you do, some content just kind of flies unnoticed. I have about 24,000 followers on Twitter, and I will frequently post things that just get nothing but crickets. So you need to make sure that you don't end up being completely anonymous. And what I'll do is I'll do very small, very targeted promotions. And yes, I would even do Facebook because you can target these random affinities, and I'll talk about that in a second. But you can target demographics, obviously. You can target interests. And you can target psychographics. So you can look at this and say, all right, business, early adopters, late adopters, people who are interested in security. You can also target custom audiences. This is a really interesting one. If you have an email list, you can upload the email list and make sure that your ads show up for folks on that list. That gets a little expensive. But if you want direct targeting, particularly around an event, it's a really, really good way to do it. Again, I saw a lot of your signups to go to a baseball game. This is where that could work really well if you know that there's an affinity between your potential clients and a love of baseball. You can also target folks who have visited your website. Again, this gets a little bit more expensive. This is the one that I really, really like to talk about, and that's boosting posts just using Facebook's regular boost tool. Facebook, the way their feeds work now is if you post something to Facebook, they're not guaranteeing that all your friends and followers will see it. They're saying they'll show it to the friends and followers who appear to be most interested. On the other hand, if you spend $30 to boost it, they will make sure it shows up to all your friends and followers. So boosting posts can really, really be helpful if that one post is something that you really want to have folks see. The only other thing I'll say about any form of social promotion is never buy per impression promotions, ever. Just don't do it. You can light money on fire so quickly that you will not have time to stop it before you spend that $30,000. The only time you would do pay for impression is if you're doing a pure branding play. And this goes across all the different networks because they all give you the opportunity to buy per impression, obviously, because they think that's a much better way to do it. So on LinkedIn, you can do the same thing. You can post a piece of content and then boost it. And I don't know how many of these you've done, but there's this little advertise button. LinkedIn makes it a little bit more difficult to find the stuff. Create a new campaign, say that you're going to sponsor a piece of content, pick the content, and then pick who it is that you want to promote to. So what are the job titles? You know, for us, we will almost always point to folks like this, and I'll actually save lists of job titles that seem to have worked particularly well, and then I set limits. And setting the limits, again, absolutely critical. So notice I set a daily budget, I set a total budget, I set a date on which this is going to end. And again, I know, at $5 a click, I'm not going to get very many clicks, right? I'm going to get maybe 4 or 5 clicks a day. That's not the point. I'm trying to get in front of those specific people. But if you don't look for those limits, if you don't put those limits in place, you're going to have a car wreck at some point. I've seen it happen. No matter how much you think you're going to be keeping an eye on it, no matter how much you think someone else is going to keep an eye on it, something will get away. So for Facebook, I kind of rate all these different networks. For Facebook with paid promotions, it's very targetable. The relevance is for you, and the cost is very low. So you want to use it to target specific people and specific individual contributors at very large organizations. When I say individual contributors, I mean people who aren't necessarily decision makers, but may go back and talk to the decision makers. Twitter is even less relevant. Targeting is lower, and the cost, if you do a paid promotion, can be higher, but I would still recommend doing organic there because that's where a lot of the people who write about your industry hang out. LinkedIn, super relevant, super targetable. As you saw, the cost per click is more expensive. To me, it's still almost always a no-brainer. You definitely want to go and do LinkedIn, and you definitely, if you have the money, want to do a paid promotion. Even if you're only buying 1 click a day, is probably worth doing. StumbleUpon for paid and for organic, targeting is not so great, relevance is very low, cost is very low, but because it's so cheap, it's not a bad way to try and get that random boost. I've had times when I've gone on StumbleUpon organically and gotten 10,000 stumbles, but one of those 10,000 is for a journalist who happens to see it, and then they publish it. And the same thing with paid promotions for StumbleUpon. Google Plus does not have a paid offering yet. It's coming. In fact, I don't know, you may be big enough that you've been let into the beta of it. We are not. Organic posting on Google Plus is an absolute no-brainer. And again, curation on Google Plus is a great thing to do, again, because it integrates with so many different tools out there. And just understand, organic and paid social promotion, the goal is not this. The goal is not to get in front of 20 bazillion people, okay? The goal is to get in front of buyers and amplifiers under specific circumstances, particularly amplifiers. Social is not where people search. It's not where they research things. It's where they discover things. So they're going to happen upon you. And some of them will some people will happen upon you at a time when they really wanted whatever it is you're providing. Most people will happen upon you at a time when they don't really want what it is that you're offering. That's okay. Because like I said, organic social takes very little effort and it's very low cost. Paid social, and costs nothing. Paid social is very low cost and super targetable. So one example is a post that I did a few weeks ago. It was really long, and I did not expect many people to read it. But I promoted it on LinkedIn, and it got a little bit of a burst on LinkedIn and Twitter, and then Buffer, the tool that I showed you before that lets you schedule, Buffer actually looked and noticed it and decided it was something they wanted to feature, because Buffer will recommend content to put into your buffer to queue up. They put that article in the buffer, and all of a sudden it went absolutely ballistic. And again, most of those tweets were terrible quality. I think a lot of people take content that Buffer recommends and schedule it without even reading it. But there were a few key people who read it, who retweeted it, and that got a lot of coverage from people who really paid attention. Some other best practices, and this is for both organic and paid promotion. Use relevant hashtags. So, one of my favorite sites is hashtags.org. You can type in things that you think might be a hashtag, see if they're there, and then use the existing hashtag. Don't create a new one. So, for example, network security may have one. Security may have one. Storage, data storage may have one. Disaster recovery probably has one. When you use those, you get involved in a larger stream of traffic, a larger conversation. And note that hashtags are used on Facebook, on Twitter, on Google+, and to a less official extent on LinkedIn. So, hashtags are pretty universally accepted now. I'm reiterating this because it's really important. Be very careful about social voting sites. Put content there if you think it's something that's really going to be fascinating to that audience, and you have to be really objective and really hard on your own content before you do that. I've posted stuff to both Hacker News and Reddit. I have about a 50-50 success rate between being roundly abused and having something that really elicits interest. A big part of it is building a presence on those networks. So if you just go on Reddit for the very first time and you post a piece of content and say, hey, here's my new article, you're probably going to get torn to pieces. If, on the other hand, you go on Reddit, you comment on other people's stuff, you post a few articles of your own, and then you post something, you have a better chance of it succeeding. And I don't want to make it sound like these are terrifying places. They're not. Just be really careful, particularly because you have a brand to protect. You don't necessarily want to go out there and be seen as just kind of posting crazy stuff in there. Some best practices around markup, and I know that you all probably don't have much control over this, but think about it, because WordPress really lets you do a lot of this. You want to make sure that you have Open Graph Protocol markup on your site, and this is something that Facebook has really pioneered. It's something that if you use it, then when your article is posted on Facebook, there's an extra little bit of content displayed, like the featured image, a more lengthy description, the title, more information about you in general. If someone shares your content, all that information follows it. So OGP markups are really useful. So are Twitter cards. And again, it's specific markup. And in the link bundle, I've included a test tool for Twitter cards, and I've included links to the OGP markup standards and Twitter card markup standards. And then Google authorship. This may be the most critical. And again, I'm going to link to articles that talk about it. I'm not going to talk about it here because it's been just beaten to death out in the world there. Plus, chances are it's either already implemented on your site or you're going to hand it over to someone else to implement. So here's just an example of the influence of that kind of markup. So this is a Twitter card. And when someone retweets an article I wrote, if you click Show Summary, this is what it shows. And notice there's a featured image, there's a longer description, there's a longer title, and notice it goes way outside of the 140 character limit. This also made a big difference in the shareability of this article. So just keep that in mind. For sharing buttons, whoops, you lost me. Okay, hold on a second. Can you hear me now? Hello? Can folks hear me now? Just checking. Because nothing's really changed here, and it looks like audio is working for me. Okay, Not sure what happened there, probably an internet glitch. The slides and the videos and the link bundle are all being shared, I believe, and the link to the link bundle is actually in this presentation, so you'll be able to jump out and see that whenever you want to. Make your sharing buttons sticky wherever possible. Michelle, I'll show you the link at the very end. Yeah, thanks, Rhonda. I'll keep that in mind. Make your sharing buttons sticky, meaning as people scroll up and down, you want your sharing buttons to remain visible on the screen. And again, there are tools for WordPress that will do that. Also, show social proof. If people share, show the count of shares. Now, some people are very resistant to showing the count of shares because they're afraid that if there's 0, it will discourage people. I've done testing that seems to contradict other testing out there, so that if folks take a look, if folks come to your page and there's a 0, that still gets you more shares than if there's no number there at all. Just kind of keep that in mind. Also, folks, if you're having audio issues on your end, don't worry about it because I am recording all of this. So that's social promotion. Any questions about social promotion? I am going to have a longer time for Q&A at the end, maybe 10 minutes. So, okay, I'm going to talk about analytics. This is actually really important because content is seen as this kind of general thing that's hard to measure. There is some nerdishness coming, and I apologize for that, but again, you'll want to come back and reference this, I think. You know, your boss or supervisors or clients, whatever else, they want to know what worked and what didn't, and most important, what's it worth? And no matter what we talk about, and no matter how much we can make common sense arguments around the value of content, folks trust math. And the way the internet has influenced, the way digital marketing has influenced a lot of our internal and external clients is they now only trust math. And we kind of did this to ourselves because we've always talked about how measurable everything on the internet is. But you know, we have to find a way to measure this stuff. So this is the process that I use. I'll find the macro conversion or conversions, determine the value of it, then find micro conversions that lead to it, determine the value of that. Then I figure out which content generates those micro conversions. Then I use the value of the micro conversions to determine the value of the content. And then that tells me what else to do. And I'm going to go over this in a lot of detail. So, you know, this is the process that I visualize, all right? That content's viewed, it makes something good happen that leads to something else good happening. So step 1 is find that macro conversion and determine its value. This is the easiest part. Macro conversions go directly to the bottom line, which means no more than 2 degrees of separation from your core business goal. In your case, I'm going with prospects. I know there's a lot of different kinds of prospect collection on your site. I know that there's many different scoring systems and classifications. I'm oversimplifying a little bit here, but this process should, in a 15-minute period, give you a pretty good idea of how you can apply this to other things. So to me, a prospect is some action that puts an individual in the sales pipeline. So you know who they are at this point. So they've either filled out a form or they've taken some specific action where you know who they are. And you want to find the value of a prospect, right? Because that's your macro conversion. What you need, the data you need, is how many prospects become leads, how many leads become customers, and what's the average value of a customer. And I'll talk about why you probably don't get all this data and how to deal with that in a moment. But you can then measure the value of that macro conversion. So if you know that 10% of prospects become leads and 5% of those leads become customers, the average customer value is $100,000, then the math is pretty straightforward. Your average prospect is worth about $500. That's the value of a macro conversion on your website. You have to get this data from your sales team, or if you're a product manager, maybe you already have it. If you can't get it, and I have found this to be the case many, many times, you have to make an educated guess. And no, I'm not kidding. You don't have much choice. You have to have something. And you may think, I'm stoned to be saying that, but you have to start somewhere. You have to start somewhere. So I will often just make a worst case estimate. I'll say, well, okay, let's say we only convert 0.5% of our leads into customers. And then when you present that data, someone will come back and say, no, we convert a lot more than that. We convert closer to 2% of our leads to customers. And that way you can start to narrow things. But you got to start somewhere. And if you don't start the conversation around this data, you may never get it. Now you have to find the micro conversions and determine their value. This is the harder part. Okay, micro conversions increase the chances that someone will become a prospect in the future. These are things like downloading something, subscribing to net results. And I know it's easy to confuse these with prospects. Again, I'm making assumptions about your scoring system, that someone is not a prospect just because they download a copy of a piece of software or because they subscribe to your newsletter. That to become a prospect, they have to take some additional step. But other micro conversions might be things like people looking at more than 5 pages, people spending more than 10 minutes on your website. Anything you can track could be a micro conversion. To find micro conversion value, you've got to figure out, how many who take that particular action, who micro convert, become prospects. So for me, let's say that people who download your software, 5% of them become prospects. So 5% of the $500 value is $25. That's how much that micro conversion is worth. Now you want to attribute content to those micro conversions. So you see what we're doing? We're working backwards from core business value to the value of a piece of content. And if the content leads directly to a micro conversion, it's very easy. This is a report that Avinash Kaushik created for Google Analytics. I have placed it in your Google Analytics profile under custom reports. So you can run this and see it now. And it shows goal completions by page and a bunch of other statistics about pages. So these are those direct conversions. This means someone who looked at this particular page then went and completed a goal. Great, but it's rarely that easy. The big elephant in the room here is that a direct conversion from a blog post to whatever the micro or macro conversion is very rare. It's usually more like this, right? People go look at a blog post, they click a few other things, and then they convert. And if you don't keep that in mind, you're really, really doing your content a disservice, because there's a lot of value that your content may be generating of which you are completely unaware. And people look at me and they say, how do I measure that at this point? Well, Google Analytics has some cool tools in it. And by the way, so do most other analytics tools. So you can use this as an example, and you can go find these things in the other tools. But you can look at this thing called the reverse goal path. And the reverse goal path shows from the goal backwards what pages people looked at. So if I converted by downloading a payload, and let's say that's a micro conversion, and before that I looked at a particular page on your site, and before that I looked at a blog post, I can see all of that in the reverse goal path. And what I'll do is I'll download an Excel spreadsheet that lists all those reverse goal paths, and then I create a pivot table using that sheet. And by the way, there's an example of this in all the content that I've shared with David, so he can put that up on your network. Put that in a pivot table, and then I can test all my previous steps. So I can say, just show me how many micro conversions there were based on this previous step in the goal process. And I'll look at goal previous step 1, 2, and 3, and just take a look. I'll say, okay, here's previous step 2. And notice if this is a micro conversion, someone goes to the Nationals versus Phillies game, there's one additional conversion there, which if I'm a retail business probably isn't that much, but for you all, where I'm sure one conversion is worth a lot of money, this can be pretty valuable. Then I'll look at goal step 3. And again, there's a couple of conversions there, and it just keeps adding up. And what you start to figure out is, yes, there's 11 conversions where this was a direct conversion, but there's 2 more that are from goal previous steps, things that we wouldn't have noticed if we didn't look at that. So those pages are generating value. We know there were 46 page views. You can use page views or unique page views. I usually use page views because it's less charitable. And again, I'm all about the worst case scenario. Mike is probably laughing hysterically on the phone right now. Mike at Portent. But I'm all about the worst case scenario. So I go with page views, not unique page views. And then the simplest math, and I'm not saying that this is precise, but the simplest math is you get 13 downloads for 46 page views. That's about 30%. So the value of a page view is about $7. So if you spend $5,000 producing an absolute premium piece of content, around 690 page views will bring you even. Now, this is very fuzzy math, okay? Any statistician is going to look at this and they are going to pop a blood vessel in their heads because this is not very precise. For one thing, second and third order views of a piece of content before a goal they're probably worth less, right, than a primary, than a direct microconversion. However, it beats the heck out of guessing. It really does. And also, over time, you can improve the model, and you don't have to be a statistician to do it. If you're getting steady feedback from the sales team of conversion, the value of a macro conversion, then you can continuously adjust the value of a micro conversion and work backwards from there. And again, you don't have to be a mathematician. I know this sounds really complicated as I'm going over it here. After you've done it a few times, it's actually pretty straightforward because Excel has a lot of the tools you need to do. And I'm talking this way about it because I'm a history major with a law degree. Math was never something that was my strong suit. So this was all pretty scary to me when I was figuring it out. But now it's pretty easy for me to do. So next up, now you know which content is most valuable within what time period. So you want to figure out what the attributes are of that content that may matter, and you want to do that more, right? That's the essence of marketing strategy. Figure out what works and do it more. You remember that content inventory? This is where the more complex content inventory can be very valuable. So at Portent, we have this crawler thing that goes out and finds all sorts of attributes of content. And maybe we look at a piece of content on the Portent website and we see that the average page on the Portent site is worth $5, which would be in my dreams, the average page view. But we have one piece of content where the average page view is $10. So we look at that and say, okay, this page performs really well. Why is that? And we can look at this particular piece of content and say, okay, let's look at the attributes of this content. It gets lots of LinkedIn votes. Well, it's hard to tell whether that's cause or effect, so we'll ignore that for now. It's fairly long, right? It's 5,500 words. It's fairly easy to read. So the reading ease and the grade level of the content, and I'm going to include a link to the tool that does this, because you can just type in a URL or cut and paste some text and it'll give you this, is fairly low. So stuff around grade 5 and 6 is most easy to read, even if it's very long. And just so you know, it's not because the readers are dumb. I talked about this before. It's just because reading online is reading online. It's not much fun. And a lot of people may be reading this using mobile. It has a lot of headings on it. So if my piece of content's much longer, stands to reason I want more headings. And then the things I talk about most are content, data, and page and strategy. Page is not very helpful, but content, data, and strategy, those might be helpful, just keeping in mind, not from an SEO standpoint, from a topical standpoint. These are things we might want to keep in mind. So you can take all of that and you can start to figure out, okay, here's some things I want to try. I want to keep my grade level lower, and I want to try that on a few pieces of content and see what it gets me. I want to do more long-form content, and long-form would generally be 20% or 10% content. I would probably do some 20% content first because it's less effort, and test it, and then move it up to 10% if it really continues to succeed, use higher production value, everything else. Do some promos on LinkedIn just because, if you look at the interest on LinkedIn, it was quite high. Might as well see if we can get it in front of more people. And again, keep the grade level lower. And just do that again and again. Now, again, it's easy to get addicted to the math. I love this little dog. It's easy to get addicted to the math. You got to be careful because, as statisticians will say, correlation does not equal causation. The fact that one thing seems to happen whenever a good thing happens does not mean that it's causing the good thing. But it does give you a yardstick. It helps you value your strategy. It helps you value and determine best attributes. It at least tells you, here is something I need to examine more closely. So instead of doing what, sorry, did someone have a question? Okay. Instead of just guessing and saying, you know what, this one did really well, I think, because it got more page views, and I think the reason it did it was because of this or that, you can actually say, this one was more valuable within my framework, and it looks to me like the last 10 pieces of content I had that were more valuable all had this one attribute. They all did this one thing. So I'm going to test that. That's why this kind of analytics is so valuable. If for no other reason, then it gives you something to show to other people when they're asking, how are you figuring out what to write and why? And because it gives you a method of measuring the success and the value of content besides keywords. Right? You don't have to look at your content and say, oh, look at this. I'm writing this article about this one topic, which is a topic for which I'm trying to rank, et cetera, et cetera. You can actually look and say, this piece of content was valuable. And more often than not, that's going to parallel the best stuff for search anyway. But this lets you get out ahead of it. Because if you think about it in search, maybe there's entire phrases that people search for all the time, but no one has any good content for it, so you never see any traffic on it. Or maybe there's phrases that people don't even type in because they don't even think of them yet. And if you start writing about them, you'll be the first one to corner that market. So instead of being reactive, you can be much more. You can be a planner. You can work ahead of what folks are thinking. So we have covered a lot of stuff in basically 3 hours of talk. I am, of course, available for questions now and later, but I just want to run through very quickly what we talked about. So the key concepts here, the things I would love for you to walk away with, 70-20-10, the blank sheet of paper rule, basic best practices, those 8 or 9 rules we talked about, best practices around promotion, and definitely analytics. And again, none of these things are set in stone, but they're all things that if you start with them, if you use them as a starting point, it can get good discussions going, and it can get you started on taking a pretty good approach to content. And remember why you're doing this, right? Because there's a huge competitive opportunity. All companies focus on consideration intent and conversion-driven content, and you do too, and you do a really good job with it. If you can put some more energy into discovery-based content, you can gain a huge competitive advantage because so few companies do it well. And you can follow this process to do it, right? So you can sketch out your customers, figure out who they are and what their interests are. You can figure out what they go through as they're thinking about your product, what's their process through this funnel. Find the gaps in the funnel, places where you don't have content, and fill those gaps with content. Figure out the micro conversions on your site. Find the behaviors that lead to those micro conversions, so the pages that people look at, the other things that people do. Do analytics based on that. Create that calendar, and then create and promote your content. That's the process in a nutshell. That's what we've tried to go over in the last 3 days. And at this point, I want to just open it up to questions. Remember, this is the link bundle, and I believe that David is posting that to your sales and marketing resource library. So any questions? I feel like I just raced through this huge quantity of stuff. Rhonda, you said you have a few comments?
I do. Ian, first off, I wanted to share with you I've had several bits of feedback from parts of the organization that I've had a chance to listen to a few of these sessions. And the preliminary comments are that this has been very useful and helpful. I would like to thank you for putting together such a great training session, and I'd like for all of us to put some thought into what the next set of these would look like. That's number one. So, but again, thank you.
You're welcome.
The second thing is around the social voting site. That is actually not in our strategy. right now from a company perspective. I do like the idea because it's very compelling, and it certainly has the ability to trigger some viral activity. It sounds like.
Yeah, yeah.
And that would really, to me, that sounds like the place that we could actually benefit from it. And I would ask that if any of you are considering using social voting in any way, and you want to attach it to the work that we're doing at NetIQ or the Attachmate Group, I'd like to have a strategy conversation about it and really think through how we can do that in a way that's completely beneficial and won't damage the brand. And I know you mentioned that, Ian, but I really wanted to add some caution and excitement around it, because it sounds like it could be really powerful. So if somebody gets to be a super user and wants to get out there and do it, I like the idea of piloting it. If somebody is just going to start willy-nilly posting, let's put the brakes on.
Yeah, no, don't.
Yeah.
Do not do that. And in fact, what David just said in the chat room is a very good point. A lot of the time, the reason you do other social media promotion is that someone who is not a NetIQ person may repost it to a social voting site, and there's nothing better than that. But be so careful about posting this stuff on any social voting site. It should be a subject of a lot of discussion before you do it. And yeah, I think, Rhonda, you're right. It needs to be underlined about 1 million times.
So then the last thing I wanted to talk about is around analytics. And for those, I use Buffer myself, and I love it. And I'm also, I think most of you who know me well know that I'm a gearhead myself. So I love analytics, and I want to caution everyone that as you start using analytics, it's extremely addictive, and it can become a huge time suck, because you'll spend all of your time looking at the analytics and none of your time actually planning, creating, developing new content. So as you think about how you're going to measure the work that you do, I'd really like to encourage you to think about it in terms of directional rather than micro, because the deeper you go, you certainly have the ability to go as deep as you absolutely want to, but the value in this to us as a company, and the reason we're asking you to do it, is to get that top-level discovery and awareness stuff that Ian referred to, not, go all the way down to the deepest, darkest bowels of the analytics and know exactly what happened, why, when, where, and how. That's not where we think the value of this activity is. The value is completely around the directional discovery pieces. So, Ian, I don't know if you'd want to add anything to that, but that was one other caution flag I wanted to raise and just add a little bit of flavor to what you said.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important perspective on it, and it's completely correct. When I talk about how it's a starting point and it's not precise, I think Rhonda said it much better. You're looking for a general sense of direction. You're looking for the things that appear to work better in a trended sense. You're not looking to say to someone, this one piece of content was worth this much money. You're looking to use that in a bigger picture to be able to just say, okay, you know what? Content that I share at this time of day seems to work better. Content that talks about this one subject seems to work better. You don't need to dive deeper than that.
Hey, Ian, I was just thinking too, I don't know if you follow Joel from Buffer App on Twitter or look at his blog.
Yeah, I do.
I love his blog, and I get so much good, just real-time, day-to-day stuff out of there. And, he's posted several times about ongoing research of when's the best time to post and certain contents that work really well. So he's one of those places that you gain the benefit of the big data that Buffer has without having to actually perform the big data action.
Well, and It's really funny you say that because this morning I added a link to his post about the best times to tweet. so, so yeah, it's in there. And if
Yeah, they do a really good job.
yeah, yes, they do. They use their data very, very well.
So anyway, that's all I have, and I apologize for taking up too much time in case people have questions. But those were a couple things I wanted to get out there.
Yeah, no, I think that was great.
Anybody else?
I actually have one quick question with Hootsuite. Where are the credentials stored? Are they actually on their site, or is it on your local machine?
It's all done using OAuth 2, so I believe that means it has to be stored on your machine, but I do not know that for certain. So you'd want to verify that if that's a concern. Actually, you know what, Michael? I have to say, I suspect it's stored on their site because if I log in using Hootsuite on another machine, I can log into my account and connect to the same accounts. So yes, you want to be careful with that. And I know that Hootsuite got hit by Heartbleed, and everyone had to go in and change their passwords. So you do want to be careful with that. If that's a concern, unfortunately, the only way to stay secure is to access them all individually.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay, well, if you have questions as they come up, you can send them to David or Rhonda. I'm not sure who's going to be the point person for that. And then they can forward them on to me, and I will answer them as quickly as I can. And Mike Fitterer here at Portent will also be a kind of a clearinghouse for questions. So if stuff comes up, please. And David just said send the questions to him. So please send the questions to David, and he'll forward them on to me. I like and want to answer those questions for you. All right, thanks everybody. I will talk to you soon.